We have one more session, and if we're disciplined, even though we've started late, we will have time for a few questions at the end. I'm sure people have them. It's been such an inspiring group of presenters. This final session is going to be with two people who, again, have been selected to make the rest of us feel like we haven't really done that much with our lives. The first is June Arunga. Can you come up to the stage, June? June is trained as a lawyer. She is now the founder and president of a film and television documentary production company. One of her documentaries is The Devil's Footpath, which is a fantastic account of a 5,000-mile journey from Cairo to Cape Town. And she also is an expert on what seems like, and I feel bad saying this because it sounds like an ad for Sanjeev, but she's an expert on the cell phone revolution in Kenya. So more mobile phone support, I think. The second person who we'll be talking to is Mark Shuttleworth. It's hard for me to summarize in a couple of sentences all of Mark's interests. They range from actually having been a cosmonaut, I mean that actually going up into space, and most impressively, in my view, spending 7 months in Kazakhstan. I've only managed about 7 days at a time. Also, Mark is a great proponent and supporter of science and math education in South Africa. He's a technology entrepreneur. Everything from internet piracy to venture capital to working on free operating software. And we will have a very wide-ranging conversation. And then we will invite all of our panelists up on stage and throw the floor open to questions. Pardon me? I wanted to start, June, with you. And what I really wanted to ask you was your experience as a woman engaging with these development issues. What is the special role that women have in development and in using technology for development?
I don't really feel confident to say what the special role for women in development is, but as far as my experience goes, I would say people give me slack to say things because I'm a girl, and so it helps me get away with stuff where it is politically incorrect in certain audiences to say certain things, and also being African kind of also gives me some slack because they say she must know what she's talking about. So I have to be more disciplined to actually do the homework because I can get away with stuff. I don't know if that answers your question, but as far as the Grameen experience goes, I think that tells a story more about women's role in development. As far as my experience getting engaged with these things, it's a very personal thing. I was just curious, why are some countries poor? Why are some wealthy? Why doesn't my country seem to work right? And I decided to go out and try and understand how the world works.
Mark, I wanted to ask you, one of your goals, both as a philanthropist and as an investor, is to find ways that African companies can work on technology on a global platform. Do you think that's possible? And what particular areas do you think African companies might be best at?
No, I'd take a completely different view. The first thing I would say is that we shouldn't have the assumption that African companies can't play a role on the global stage in any kind of field. Secondly, I'd ask the question, where are African companies going to be most likely to be successful? Technology is not necessarily a big driver for me in Africa. When I invest in Africa, technology isn't sort of what I'm looking for, except in the way that technology can unleash the raw potential of people, that are there. The mobile phone example is an extraordinary one in terms of unlocking underlying economic potential that was blocked. Media is another example of ways in which technology is helping to bring out the best of what's actually right there in front of us in Africa. So, but I don't necessarily see Africa as the next, I don't think the next Silicon Valley is
not the next Bangalore?
No. So just because I'm fascinated by technology doesn't necessarily mean that I would assume that that we should try and recreate that in Africa. We just look for the right magical mix of raw potential and possibility.
And how important is education? We've heard from Sanjeev of the role that the really excellent elite Indian higher educational institutions have played in that country's phenomenal transformation.
Right,
how important is it in Africa, and at what level do you think it's most important? Higher education, primary education?
You couldn't ask for better examples than India and Korea, for example, of countries that understood the connection between an investment in education and an investment in science and technology, and the economic returns that you can expect to see over the next sort of generations from that investment. So that's a message that I try and carry to Africa as strongly as possible. But that investment in education has to go together with a real investment in economic potential, because education without jobs and without an excitement around jobs within the continent or within wherever the focus of your investment is, just creates a community of people who will be exported, right? They become expatriate Africans. And so the bulk of my investment, again, is in economic activity of all forms. And then education is really a catalyst to try and make sure that there's a pool of talent to drive that forward.
And Jim, your views on education?
I think that education is important, but I have seen that where people have been allowed to engage in commerce and given the support structure such as not just infrastructure but even telephony, people who have never gone to school have managed to pull themselves out of poverty and provide education for subsequent generations. So for me, Africa has this one foot in the Middle Ages and one at the edge of the 21st century. Both educated and uneducated people share the Middle Age experience, where many of them don't have access to electricity and so on. And both educated and uneducated are sharing this edge of 21st century, using their telephones for doing banking and so on and so forth. That was all changed overnight by the stroke of a pen when the government decided to allow the private sector to provide telephony.
Which government?
The Kenyan government, for example. And so by law, people were relegated to living a Middle Ages life. And by the stroke of a pen, it was changed overnight without the education changing and so on. And so for me, the freedom the governments have in their hands, the power to give the people to just engage with the rest of the world, is primary.
So if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is you don't have to wait to have a highly educated workforce. You have to unleash what's there.
You have to unleash
and make the rules so that they can effectively empower themselves, and then build an education system around that over time. Is that?
To reiterate what Sanjeev said, I see poverty and its manifestations as just demand for goods and services, a lot of which our governments have just termed illegal for anybody to be part of. It's illegal to send text messaging in Ethiopia, for example. How ridiculous is that? Western Union is banned there, even in South Africa, kind of. So there's certain goods and services that people need, and we just have political systems that have banned them. So they can educate all they like, but you don't have the ability to do with your mind what you would like to do on the market. So you see these opportunities, you see ways to make money, but you can't.
So really, do you think the first most important thing is actually about getting the right government structures, at least to a certain extent, at least to stop preventing people from doing things?
That is so primary. The difference between Mauritius, why Mauritius was up there, and why we had I think that software is so cool. I really want to have my hands on it, because there's a caricature of the poor person that has been made.
We didn't plan this in advance, by the way.
that it's so hard to explain in many words, and that software just explained it. But the difference between Mauritius up there and Sierra Leone down there is just the government allowing people to trade. That whole free trade thing is removing these laws in place that make it so difficult for business people, whether they're local or foreign, to meet the demands that people have. Goods and services.
And why do you think there are so many bad governments? Are there elites that benefit from these laws that block wider progress? Or is it just lack of understanding?
I think that's a really complex issue. There's a historical context to it. There's It's a very complex question. I don't know if I'm...
The really important thing to realize as an investor in Africa is that you have a choice of regulatory regimes, right? It's not like China where you have the advantage of really a common market, a huge, quite diverse underlying, but fundamentally a common market. In Africa, you have a tremendous ability to choose where you direct your investments and so what regulatory regime you'll be working under. And increasingly, we're seeing competition between African countries trying to attract that investment, trying to understand what rules they need to create to unlock their inner potential and to attract investments. So this perception of Africa as a place of institutional bad governance is quite mistaken. It's a place of very diverse governance, and you can make it work for you. So Sanjeev was saying that he is able to do business in Africa without having to break ethical rules or formal government rules, right?
And which country really right now do you think is the best one to invest in?
Oh, Botswana, for example, is a great example of a country that is a small African country that is beautifully run. There are things that we can criticize them about, without doubt. They have a horrendous HIV infection rate, but it has had a stable democratic government for a long time, a very open economy, and the people have benefited tremendously from that. Mauritius is another example, basically setting itself up as a conduit for investment into the continent. So you certainly can find non-obvious places to go establish infrastructure, establish a brand, and so on.
What's the worst place? Is there a place you wouldn't touch right now?
No, because I fundamentally believe that economic engagement is the right way to bring about change, and it's when you create a sort of a policy.
As a businessman, though, maybe I'll rephrase. What would be your least desirable?
Invested in Zimbabwe. It's a country with enormous potential that's just north of South Africa's borders, and whatever it has tragic and appalling governance right now, but that will change. And so I have to believe that there will be a reversion to the mean and possibility there.
June, I just want to ask June, will you take on my question of what is the worst country? A place that you wouldn't advise people to do business in?
I don't know. I think business people are most in touch with the realities of things on the ground, more than pundits like me. But I think Zimbabwe is scary at the moment, and it's so unpredictable, and I would say it sounds like a very risky place to try and own something, anything, get a business.
It is, but if you think about this, in the business world, we have evolved tools to deal with risk, and once you understand that, once you realize that the place where value is created is the place where change is the greatest. This picture that was on the screen here shows you that the inevitable migration of people in Africa is along that curve to the top left corner. It is, folks in Africa have exactly the same aspirations, exactly the same human potential. They will make that journey. And so if you're investing there right now, you're going to be carried with that momentum. And we're starting to see very big global companies discover this, and discover that all the rules of unlocking local talent and so on apply just as much in Africa as they do elsewhere. I'm very confident in it as an investment destination.
June, you've done some work, I think, on immigration. What role do you think immigrants are playing, and are we seeing some of that money and knowledge feeding back in the form of remittances and knowledge exchanges?
I think the primary role that immigration plays is actually manifesting the competition between legal systems, basically. What people choose as a place that they would rules they'd like to live under. We see the biggest migration in the world, basically. I'd like to see that done with the software that was shown earlier. But if there was an arrow, the fattest one would be going to America. And people might say whatever they like about America, but people make this choice. They hear it from their relatives or whatever. It's by word of mouth, but they make the choice and they move there. They decide to take their brains there. And one of the things that fascinated me when I was young was that I'd have relatives who had PhDs stay in Kenya, be unemployed, 10 years, have my mother, who was just a civil servant, have to support them. But the moment they went to America, whether as illegal immigrants or as legal immigrants, everything changed. This person's same brain just crosses over there, and suddenly they blossom and make a ton of money. And I wanted to find out what that was about. So one big role is that it shows within Africa, or as people move to other places, just like the movement of capital, where people find most conducive to create value. And secondly, I think that even though people complain about brain drain, I would say that if you can move your brilliant brain from point A to point B and earn enough money to actually feed your family back home, send them to school, it makes more sense than all of you staying in this one place where nothing is going for you and all dying. So I think that people being able to move to other places and be able to support their families is very valuable. Those remittances are money used to start businesses. Their money, it's a lifeline. So it's a great way for governments to compete, and people are forced to think, what's wrong? Why are we losing people? And probably it's a driver of reform.
So that's really
that
interesting.
way.
You think this concern that we're sometimes hearing, for example, around the NHS about bringing African medical staff to Britain is really quite unfair to the people it's addressed at?
When African doctors and nurses started moving, I'll just say Kenyans primarily, because that's what I've researched. When they started moving, the Kenyan government was forced to ask themselves what they were doing wrong to lose these doctors. It forced a lot of reforms within our healthcare policy, and now doctors have been given more freedom to be able to start private hospitals if they want. Licensing is much easier to partner with foreign doctors. They wanted to use better technology. They wanted to have access to models of doing their work that they would find beneficial and would meet market demand. And that would not have happened if they just weren't able to leave. So I think that people's hearts always remain at home, even when they leave, especially if you're a doctor. You know how much good you could do after, especially you've come out here and seen just what's available and so on and so forth. And when you can be a part of that conversation, because somebody is now realizing that their policies are what sent you off, then you have a chance to then make your voice. So I think the constituency of doctors who've moved out have formed a very vital, what's the word, kind of the industry association that's forming is a very powerful lobby for reform after they leave.
I think that's a really fascinating perspective on it. We had a red light. We have actually 10 minutes before our session is meant to end at 1:45. My one key duty that I've been charged with is ending promptly, but I'm really pleased that we do have 10 minutes for questions and answers. So if the other panelists could come join us. Please, now's your chance to ask questions. Only 10 minutes of these incredibly fascinating people with diverse experiences. If you could, when you ask a question, please direct it at a specific person or maybe at two specific people. If everyone tries to answer, we won't get through more than half a question. Please. And if you could maybe go to the mics, it'll be easier for me to recognize people.
Hi, I'm Martin Versavsky from FON. I had a question about Africa, and it's, do you think Africans see themselves as Africans?
And who is the question directed towards? Mark and June,
well,
maybe?
whoever wants to answer.
Okay, I'll try Mark and June. Mark, you want to go first?
Sure, I do think that there is a strong sense of African identity. Obviously, in the last 2 generations, there's also been a layer of national identities and divisions imposed upon that. But I think that doesn't penetrate very deeply into the psyche. So I would look forward 100, 150 years and say Africa will act and operate as a single entity.
June?
I kind of feel differently. Maybe I feel more African when I'm engaging with the outside world, but I find it easier to relate to people from outside than with certain other Africans, because when I did the journey from Cairo to Cape Town, the diversity of Africa really hit me. A lot of these people are just, they're way more different than
we are.
Yeah, I think if we had that software and we could show, you would see how there are ways in which people in England and people in certain African countries share more in common than people in one African country feel with the others. And another thing is they don't travel much between the countries. It's very diverse. I don't know how to explain it better.
Okay, Professor Rosling wanted to add something.
Some of the African scholars I work with say, I long for the day when people stop writing about Africa. They feel like Africans, of course, but they want to show the diversity within it. Always you take the war in Darfur, you take the AIDS epidemic of Botswana, you take the government situation of Ivory Coast. You always take the worst of each part and make it to a unity of Africa. You don't take the economy of Ghana, the HIV, 0.7% of Senegal, lower than United States, the wonderful government situation of Botswana, which you told about, which is great, and all the positive things which is happening. I think Africa is the continent that have done best the last 50 years. They started many countries from a pre-medieval situation, and they are already way through the 19th century. They've carried most distance in the last 50 years, and it's really promising what it will be able to do. And Europe, in the middle of the 19th century, had a terrible lot of war, and civil wars and all these sort of things. This continent has been the worst for that. And there's a lot of talent, especially a lot of young talent, which you will see. And I would just add what I see also African colleagues of mine who work on government sector say, the government now have to catch up with this economic growth. Now we have 5 to 6% economic growth in Africa. Now we have macro credits working. Now we need to get all kids into public schools. We need to use that extra resources we have to match up with infrastructure, with governance, better port function, and then economy will flourish even more. So I see also a lot of positive things happening. I worked in Mozambique. I mean, it went from a disaster to a very positive situation today.
Please.
I'm Richard Eyre. I have a question for Sanjeev as the business leader in this group. Do you buy the notion that that business taking steps that spread well-being, that is so welcomed by your customer that it is an appropriate and a valuable contributor to shareholder value? So can you engage in multi-million-dollar programs that don't sell more mobile phone contracts because they're good things and your customers will welcome them?
Well, as a business leader, you're accountable to 3 constituencies: your shareholders, your customers, and your employees. If you tilt the balance in the favor of any one of those, the equation gets awkward. So you have to balance all 3 of them. But I'll speak personally as an individual. If I put my business hat away, I think we have no choice but to make a difference in Africa. We have no choice but to make a difference in parts of China, parts of India. If we don't step up to it in this generation, when we have the wherewithal, we have the technology, we have the resources, then we will miss a massive opportunity. Africa is not one continent. We call it a continent. We try to do a paintbrush approach to Africa. India is not one. China is not homogeneous. I think as corporations, and we're going to see a new generation of corporations come up that are as committed to the social cause as they're committed to the economic cause. And hopefully I can do one of those one of these days. Because that is the kind of a commitment we all need to make. It is not about charity. It is about taking a part of the family we are all a part of in this world and trying to do what is right for that. And that takes a lot more than just what shows on my balance sheet or what shows on earnings per share. It takes a level of personal commitment and say, what are we really all about? And I think business has to step up. Now, I'm not speaking as an orange person. I'm speaking as an individual. I think we must do that.
Sanjeev, you're meant to be starting a new venture in June. Could it be along these lines?
Well, let's watch the space, Krista.
Any more questions? Yeah, please.
I'd just like to come back to David Miliband's point earlier today about the principle of creating a culture where everybody can. What do you do in a country like Zimbabwe where the government doesn't allow you to participate in this principle?
And is there any one...
Sanjeev, maybe.
Look, I think Zimbabwe is, we were talking about Botswana. Zimbabwe was a great country that has been totally messed up, thanks to the government. But it is a great country. We need to ensure that the people in that country communicate with the rest of the world. We look at, I read a lot about Zimbabwe. I think it's a wonderful opportunity for somebody to go in and ensure we get every citizen of Zimbabwe connected with everybody in this room. How do you do that? Let's for a minute assume we could take, and every school, every hospital, every street corner, we could provide connectivity to the internet. And every citizen had ability to get on a mobile phone and talk. That will change the country. That will change the ground reality. And what does it take to do it? Not a heck of a lot. Not a lot of financial commitment. This is a few changes, and this is, I think people miss the point. If you just say that we are going to provide 500 kiosks, internet kiosks, in 5 major cities of Zimbabwe, that anybody can go in any time of the day and get connected to the internet, and people start reading what is happening in the other parts of Zimbabwe, that most of the citizens that are living there have no idea, you will transform the country. And I think that's the kind of stuff that's needed. Zimbabwe was a great economy, and it got messed up. We just need to bring them back into the fold of the rest of the world.
Mark?
Yeah, I think many folks don't realize that the government of Zimbabwe has been elected through a series of election victories, and while those victories were controversial, they weren't outright frauds. And so the question has to be asked, really, how do we convince the people of Zimbabwe to express their own will differently? And there is a certain amount of repression and so on. But the biggest thing I think we need to show the folks of Zimbabwe is that other African countries voting for their own leaders are getting very different results. And so what you're really describing is the process of connecting people and showing them that the lives that they lead are a consequence of their choices, and that other countries from similar backgrounds, similar circumstances, are getting great results by making different choices. If we do that, Zimbabwe will change extremely quickly, and the underlying potential will come back.
I'm a journalist, so I guess my job is to be the professional cynic among this group of very optimistic, energetic world transformers. But no one has said anything about Eastern Europe or the former Soviet Union, which is my area of expertise. So I will quickly tell one story that backs up Sanjeev's point. I reported on the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and I spent a lot of time talking to those student demonstrators who sat out in the square in the Maidan Nezalezhnosti and overthrew what was actually one of the region's more repressive authoritarian regimes. And I talked to them a little bit about how they organized, because actually the Orange Revolution was the culmination of maybe 9 months of regional protests that had sort of started off in smaller towns and just mounted and mounted and mounted. And I said, how did you guys have these protests when the cops could just pick you up and beat you up, or they beheaded a journalist? These were not nice guys. And they told me this great story about the internet and telephones coming together, which is what they would do, and this is a technique they learned from the Serbian student protesters, whom they met online, was have your little local protest, and then if your friends get picked up by the local police and thrown in jail, send out a message online, basically to all Ukrainians, saying, our friend Ihor has been arrested, he's in the Kremenchuk jail, and this is the switchboard number. Phone it now. And through the pure harassment of these local police stations, which would then get thousands of calls for the next 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 hours, they said 80% of the time the police would just throw their hands up. The kids hadn't really done anything wrong and just let them go. So that for me was a great story about how very simple technology-enabled forms of protest can be effective. On that note, I'm afraid we probably have to go. We've run out of time. If I could just say 2 things. First of all, we have an hour and 15 minutes for lunch. The next session is absolutely fantastic. It's called Let Me Entertain Me. Can't think of anything more thrilling after lunch. It's going to be hosted by Dr. Patrick Dixon, who is a noted futurist and I am asked to let you know one of the 20 most influential business thinkers alive. So I'm sure the other 19 are here as well. And before people do go for lunch, could I just ask everyone to pause for 30 seconds and say thank you very much to our fantastic group of speakers.